this video, we're going to focus on one of the key ways a business might decide to measure its profit. We call this the gross profit margin. You hear the term margins in relation to business all the time in pop culture, in films and in TV shows. You might hear expressions like "they're tight margins" or "that's a really strong margin." But in this video, we will aim to unpick exactly what all of this means. But before we can calculate the gross profit margin, we must first know what the gross profit is. As a reminder, gross profit is the difference between the sales revenue that a business makes and the cost of the goods that they have sold. So gross profit can be calculated as follows. Gross profit equals sales revenue minus costs of goods sold. Gross profit is one of the measures that shows how profitable a business actually is, how much they're making. Gross profit gives you the profit after deducting the direct costs of making or selling the business's product or service. Remember though, gross profit doesn't take into account the overhead expenses of a business, like rent and insurance. So it's all well and good making a gross profit of £50,000, but if your business expenses are £51,000, then you haven't actually made any profit. You've made a loss. To all the teachers out there, show all of these videos without any ads and gain access to our growing library of over 500 teaching worksheets. Why not visit BizzWizard.co.uk to find out more? Once we have the gross profit value, in order to allow business owners or managers to understand their business performance better, it is helpful to look at profit margins. Profit margins are a type of what we call profitability ratio, and they allow a business to look at its performance compared to previous years, or even compared to its competitors. Gross profit margin is always shown as a percentage, and it is calculated with the following formula. Gross profit margin equals gross profit divided by sales revenue multiplied by 100. So once we have this number, what does it even mean? Well, if you have a gross profit margin of, say, 70%, this means for every £1 of sales revenue that you take, you are getting 70 pence in gross profit. If you have a gross profit margin of 23%, then this means that for every £1 of revenue you take, you make 23 pence gross profit. So it might be easier to think of it this way. The gross profit margin is the percentage of each pound that is actually gross profit. In general, the higher the gross profit margin, the higher the percentage, the better the business is performing, particularly if it is increasing year on year. The gross profit margin is a measure of the impact of the decisions made by the business and the efficiency of using labour and materials to produce their goods and provide their services. On the other hand, if gross profit margins have reduced compared to previous years, then the business owner will need to understand why. It may be related to the cost of sales. Have the materials used in the business increased in costs? Or it may be related to the selling price. Perhaps this has been decreased to be more competitive, but then the gross profit margins may go down. So changes in the gross profit margin will always be related to the sales revenue or the cost of sales, because this is by definition what gross profit is. Keep in mind that it can be affected by the mix of different products sold. So for example, if a business has two different products, one with a high gross profit margin and one with a low gross profit margin, but the business ends up selling a bigger proportion of the lower margin products, then its gross profit margin will fall. Now, to understand in a little more detail, let's introduce this video's main example. This is Catherine Baines, the owner and founder of a business called Tranquil Spaces. Catherine started a successful landscape gardening business after leaving university with a business management degree over 3 years ago. She operates as a sole trader and she has 2 other members of staff. They have a small lock-up office that they operate from, which is rented, and the business continues to grow. She works with her clients to create the outside space that they desire, everything from drawing out the plans to planting the beautiful flower beds. Catherine has decided that she wants to work out her gross profit margin because she's been told that her friend Pete, who owns a rival company called Pete's Patios, has a gross profit margin of 45%. Now, before Catherine can start to look at her gross profit margin, or sometimes referred to as the GPM, she will first need to work out her gross profit. As we know, she is going to need 2 important pieces of information to work out Tranquil Spaces' actual gross profit figure. You know, the amount of profit that she has after the cost of sales. Once we have those pieces of information, we will then be able to work out the gross profit margin percentage for Catherine. Now, Catherine knows that her sales are £100,000. This is her sales revenue figure. But what should she include in her cost of sales figure? Well, cost of sales include the cost of the materials involved in selling a product or service, and very occasionally, wages or salaries linked directly to the production of it. Keep in mind, this won't always be the case, especially not at GCSE level, and the question should very specifically state if they want wages to be considered a cost of sale. It would say things like each worker is paid X amount for each unit produced, or each delivery driver is paid X amount for each delivery made. Things of this nature. In the case of Tranquil Spaces, her cost of sales will include the cost of any materials used, such as soil, flowers, and trees for planting. Catherine spends a total of £20,000 on soil, £15,000 on flowers, and £25,000 on other materials like garden furniture. And these are all direct costs of sales, things that she had to buy in order to deliver her gardening service. And this means that the cost of sales for Tranquil Spaces is a total of £60,000. So, to work out Tranquil Spaces' gross profit in pounds, we take the sales revenue of £100,000, we minus the cost of sales of £60,000, and this equals a gross profit of £40,000. And now we have the gross profit, we can actually work out the gross profit margin, the percentage of each of these pounds, which is actually gross profit. So to work out Tranquil Spaces' gross profit margin as a percentage, we need to use the following formula. Gross profit divided by sales revenue multiplied by 100. So let's slow this down a little. In this example, £40,000 is the gross profit, and this needs to be divided by the sales revenue, which in this case is £100,000, and then we need to multiply this all by 100. And this gives Catherine a gross profit margin of 40%. So for every single pound of sales revenue that Catherine makes, 40 pence of this is gross profit. Catherine knows that her gross profit margin for the year is 40%, but she doesn't really know if that's a good or a bad thing. She starts by working out her gross profit margins for the 2 previous years. Last year, the gross profit margin ended up being 39%, and in her first year of trading, it was 38%. So that's good news because it's increased every year. Surely that's a good thing, right? If things are going up year on year, then this means that the business is improved. Bring this video and over 100 more to life with fun, interactive games, quizzes, and case studies. Why not try the first 25 completely free by visiting BizzWizard.co.uk. Now, remember that she also knows that her friend Pete's company, Pete's Patios, has a gross profit margin of 45%, which is higher than Catherine's. If she wants to compete with Pete, maybe she should try to raise her gross profit margin. So she decides to look into this in a little more depth. First of all, she looks at Pete's website to see what the prices are like compared to hers. She notices that for the exact same services, his prices are generally higher. She decides to increase her prices in line with Pete's. After all, she knows he's pretty busy, so customers are prepared to pay these prices. She hopes that raising her prices in line with Pete's should improve her gross profit margin. By raising her prices, she should see an increase in sales revenue. But will this be enough? Catherine then decides to see what she can do about the cost of sales. So she looks a little more carefully at the cost of the gardening materials being used. She phones up a few suppliers and she asks them to give her some quotes. One of the suppliers is cheaper than the supplier that she normally uses. Catherine then rings her existing supplier and tells them that she has a cheaper offer, and she asks if they're prepared to reduce their prices. To her surprise, they agree to match the other supplier's quote, which when you think about it makes sense. This supplier doesn't want to lose Tranquil Spaces as a customer, especially if her business is growing. Now Catherine expects to see an improvement in her gross profit margin as a result of changing her prices and reducing her costs. She sets herself a target of 45%, and she will use this as a comparison to see how well she is doing as she moves forward. Before we go any further, let's just run through a handful of other examples of this calculation being done. Keep in mind, in these examples I have already calculated the sales revenue. If you're not sure how this is done, then check previous videos introducing this concept. So now let's calculate the gross profit. Let's first look at David Jenkins the Butcher's and their gross profit margin. So the butcher's shop has sales revenue of £300,000. And to work out the gross profit, we need to take away the cost of sales, which is £120,000, and this equals gross profit of £180,000. So, to work out Jenkins' profit margin as a percentage, we need to take that gross profit, divide it by the sales revenue, and multiply it by 100. So let's slow that down and pop the numbers into the formula. So firstly, £180,000 is Jenkins' gross profit. We just calculated this. And we need to divide this by the sales revenue, which is £300,000, and we need to multiply this answer by 100. And this gives the butcher shop a gross profit margin of 60%. So for every single pound of sales revenue that the shop takes, 60 pence of that pound is gross profit. Now, let's say Lily's dog walking business, Paws at the Doors, has a revenue of £120,000 and a gross profit of £33,000. If we were to calculate her gross profit margin, just like before, we would do the following. Gross profit divided by sales revenue multiplied by 100. So let's pop those numbers into the formula. £33,000 is Lily's gross profit. This needs to be divided by the sales revenue, which is £120,000, and then multiplied by 100. And this gives Lily a gross profit margin of 27.5%. So for every single pound of sales revenue that Lily makes walking the dogs, 27.5 pence of this is gross profit. And finally, let's look at one more example. Max is a mechanic, and he has sales revenue of £88,000 and a gross profit of £55,000. If we were to calculate his gross profit margin, we would do the following. The gross profit divided by the sales revenue multiplied by 100. So let's put the numbers in. £55,000 is Max's gross profit. This needs to be divided by the sales revenue, in this case £88,000, and multiplied by 100. and this gives Max a gross profit margin of 62.5%. Each of the video courses over at BizzWizard.co.uk also includes an interactive business case study that applies the knowledge learnt to a real-world scenario. There are over 1,000 multiple-choice questions, each with detailed feedback, which tests students' understanding of the content. Why not visit BizzWizard.co.uk to find out more? Now that we've looked at a couple more examples, let's look at the advantages of looking at gross profit margin for Tranquil Spaces. First of all, looking at the gross profit margin helps Catherine understand the relationship between her selling prices and the cost of the materials. By looking at this in percentage terms, it's helpful as Catherine can use this information to make comparisons. So she can compare her own business's gross profit margin to the previous years, even if the sales figures and the cost of sales figures are different. Catherine can also compare the gross profit margin performance of her business to that of competitors. She knows that Pete's gross profit margin percentage was 45%, and even though his sales may be different, this value can be used to easily compare the two businesses. And Catherine has been able to use this gross profit margin information to make changes to the way that she operates her business. In this case, she's looked at both her selling price compared to the main competitor, and by renegotiating the cost of the gardening materials that she buys from her supplier. Had she not analysed her gross profit margin, she may not have decided to do this. And finally, as we've seen, Catherine can set herself a target for her gross profit margin and measure herself against this to see whether the changes that she's made are having the desired effect, and that the gross profit margin is improving over time. So with the advantages discussed, it's important that we can make a balanced argument. So let's have a look at some of the potential disadvantages of looking at the gross profit margin for Catherine and her business. The main issue is that by looking at the gross profit margin, Catherine is only looking at part of the big picture. She's not considered her net profit, which we will look at in the next video. Unlike net profit margins, gross profit margins don't take into account all of the running costs of the business, and it's possible that her margins may not look as good, or she may even end up making a loss once these other expenses have been taken into account. Also, if Catherine compares her gross profit to the previous year, she may be pleased to see that it's increased, but this won't capture any of the changes to her overall running costs, which may mean that her net profit has actually gone down when she works out these figures. Finally, focusing too heavily on profit margins of any kind and constantly trying to raise prices and reduce costs of sales could mean that the business loses focus on the customer or sees a decrease in product quality, and this can negatively impact the brand image and lead to a loss of customers. So, that about sums it up. Gross profit margin. We've seen that using profitability ratios like gross profit margins can be a useful way of assessing the performance of a business, particularly because they are shown as percentages so they can be used to compare the business performance with previous years, with a target, or with another business in the same sector, maybe of a different size. We've seen that the gross profit margin takes into account sales and the cost of the sales, meaning that it is a good measure of the impact of pricing strategies and the impact of the cost of materials and labour used to directly produce a product or to deliver a service. Using the gross profit margin will not give the entrepreneur the full picture. To really understand the success of your business, you must also consider net profit margins, which we will look at in the next video. But until then, this has been the BizzWizard,